agreed to come in and talk to us. Dr. Amir Mohahheghi is at Sandia Labs. He got his PhD from in experimental high energy atomic physics at the University of New Mexico. I'm an accountant, so that's really impressive. He is the managing director of the Cooperative Monitoring Center at Sandia, which leads efforts to facilitate scientific engagement in the area of global security. There's more to be said, but I would rather Amir take the microphone and share with us his thoughts.
Last name, you almost got it. Tonight I was debating whether to put a tie on or not. I did not want to be the only person with a tie. And then I came and I saw a meal. So okay, good. I'm in good company. Thanks again for a gracious dinner and making time for us tonight. Hopefully, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our Center for Global Security and Cooperation.
Please speak into the microphone.
Okay, is this better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. This falls, just somebody yell at me, I'll bring it back.
Keep it close to your mouth.
Yeah, it's. I was going to stand here, but then I can't see the screen, so that's. When I was putting this presentation together, I came across this quotation here. This gentleman has sat in prison in 1930. At the opening of a fateful decade, the Italian anti-fascist Antonio Gramsci wrote, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying, and the new cannot be born. In this interim, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." So that's kind of symptomatic of the age we're in now. So that's what we call the third nuclear age. Just a little bit of a shameless advertisement. I teach a class at UNM that's starting next week called, I think I have a couple of students probably here who signing up for it. It's called the WMD, Non-Proliferation Science and Policy, and I talk about these things at depth. So if you want to sit in some of the lectures, you're more than welcome to. Yes. And I should also say, since I'm being recorded, I'm going to be obligated to say this. Everything I say here tonight, these are my opinions. They do not represent Sandia, Department of Energy, or the U.S. government. So it just stops right here. Okay. And now, I assume you all know about Sandia?
Yes.
Okay, so you all know that we were a division at Los Alamos National Laboratory. We were established in 1949. And then we've been managed by different entities here, different corporations. So I'll skip that so we can actually get to the meat of this thing. Now, one of the things in the 1940s and 50s, Los Alamos, Sandia National Laboratories, our business primarily was nuclear weapons, or what we call nuclear deterrence today. And in order to actually build these things and make sure they're safe, reliable, there was a world-class science and technology that was established at Sandia Laboratories and Los Alamos National Laboratories. And once we had that base of science and technology, we started applying it over time to different national security problems. So for example, in the 60s, we had the Arms Control Treaty monitoring that came up. We had a number of multilateral treaties. And the big issue was in the 50s was the height of the Cold War. And some of you remember we used to do the testing of nuclear weapons in atmosphere. Nevada test site, Russians did a lot of tests. There was a lot of concern with the environmental impact of these tests. So both we and the Soviets wanted to stop this atmospheric testing. So this idea of banning these tests. So in this case, our policymakers from Washington came to Sandia and Los Alamos and asked us if we sign a treaty with these evil Soviets, can we trust them to actually comply with this treaty, not to test in the atmosphere? And our answer was, and this is late 50s, we don't know. it was a little time, we go back, so it was a team from Sandia and also a team from Los Alamos. We got together. We actually designed a system, essentially a set of satellites called Vela satellites that go into space, but I think initially it was 6 of them to go around Earth. And I was fortunate enough to talk to one of the system designers for this system at Sandia National Labs, first when I joined in and before they retired. Actually, President Kennedy came to look at the system, and they had different policymakers coming to Sandia, Los Alamos, looking at these systems. And I asked them, how did your conversation go with the policymakers? Remember, these are scientists and engineers. So, sir, asked me, is this going to detect Soviets cheating? I said, sir, depending on these assumptions we made, under these conditions, there's a 99.2% probability we will detect it. Can I look at him? Is that a yes or no? I look back, sir, under these conditions and these things, 99.2%. So what happened? So finally somebody rescued him. So look, we have to speak policy. I said, under these contexts, 99.2% is yes. So that's something I had to learn as a physicist, how to speak policy. And sometimes I have to teach our policymakers how to speak technology. And sometimes they think we can do things that are just not possible. For example, give you one example. There was this, one of my colleagues, Ariane Pregenzer, she was supporting the negotiation of the chemical weapons treaty. And apparently one of our policymakers decided we have these gadgets that can stand outside a building, point at it, and see if there's any chemical weapons inside the building. And she said, no, you can't do that. Where'd you even come up with that idea? I thought you guys had all these secret gadgets, you could do anything. So now that's James Bond, that's not us. So this is an example of why the policy community and the technical community, they have to work together. So our job is not to make policy, let me be very clear about it. Our job is to implement policy or inform policy, give them options. Okay, this is what's possible, this is what's not possible, these are all the different options that we can do. So that went on, so the Vela satellites went to space, and the idea was if there's an explosion in the atmosphere in space, you can actually detect those explosions. So as soon as they went up, what happened? They started detecting signals, except this gamma ray and X-ray burst and radiation burst, they were not coming from explosions of nuclear weapons, they were coming from deep space. So this actually gave rise to a new field of science, gamma ray astronomy. So this is a great example of how some of these science programs for defense, they can actually feed into practical applications and advanced science. So that's one example I've used, got multiple examples. During Q&A, feel free to ask me. I'll be happy to tell you a lot of stories here. Then in the 80s, as everything evolved, remember the 50s and 60s, 70s, we were building up our nuclear weapons. In the 70s, we had the largest number of nuclear weapons. The 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis, brought us to our senses. So that was the beginning of arms control treaties. Again, the problem becomes, how do we verify the treaty that we signed? How can we trust the other side? So we're having the same issues today, by the way, with China and Russia. Right now, there's no, our last arms control treaty called the New START, that's going to expire in 2026. After that, we don't have any bilateral arms control treaties. So that's, but end of the Cold War came, and my colleagues, three of my colleagues, Ariane Pregenzer, Ken Behringer, and Mike Nannoni, remember there was a time, there was a peace dividends, the labs were shrinking. So we're getting creative, actually how to apply our knowledge to new problems. Now one of them was in the Middle East. So in the Middle East, if you remember the early 90s, there was a peace process that was happening. And then during the peace process, Israelis, Palestinians, Egyptians, and Jordanians, they were coming up to a lot of agreements, except even our Israeli friends. Is this better?
Can't understand you.
Oh, is this better?
Yes.
Okay.
There you go.
Very good. Ah, okay.
Ah, je vois.
Let me put it here. So in the early, I have to stay close to this thing. to make it work. So early 90s, there was the peace treaty that was happening, peace discussions between Israelis, Jordanians, Egyptians, and Palestinians. And these treaties and agreements had a lot of different agreements that had to be verified. To give you one example, water was one of the issues. Water is a scarce commodity in the Middle East. And they wanted to look at the water and see how much water is coming in, what's the quality of water, how can you actually verify this? So we actually put in place a monitoring system in order to go ahead and monitor, work with these Israelis and Egyptians to verify that this amount of water is coming here, this amount is going over there, so they could actually put it in place. In addition, there was other agreements in arms control and regional security that had to be verified. So that's when the Cooperative Monitoring Center was established. By the way, can you still hear me okay back there?
It's better, thank you.
Okay. And so this was the lessons that we had learned from our treaty verifications and agreements with Soviets that we started applying in the Middle East. Then we started applying in South Asia and East Asia. So that was the whole process. Let me give you one second. There we go. So in order to kind of organize our thinking for today, we looked at the nuclear ages. So it's really divided into three nuclear ages. The first one being 1945 till about 1992. So this is when we had our first nuclear weapons. There was an arms race, and we had a geostrategic situation that was bilateral, that was between Soviets and the West. So that's three drivers that we actually decided to think about, these three nuclear ages. One of them was geostrategic environment. Second one was the technology development. We being a science and technology laboratory, we had to think about technology. And the third one I put up was climate change. So the first nuclear age was from 1992 to the second nuclear age, started by 1992. That's at the end of the Cold War, till about, I would say, 2014. So this is a time, it actually was a unilateral geostrategic environment, that the West was dominant, we were rising, but Russia and China were rising at the same time. By 2014, Russia, that was the first invasion of Ukraine by Russians. So that's why we decided that second nuclear age, that's some call it transition time, that would be the end of that piece right there. So we are now in the third nuclear age. That started roughly about 2014. Some of my colleagues debated with me when that actually started. And some of the attributes of this environment, for example, it's a multipolar environment. So we have Russia rising, China is rising, we are here. So now we have a situation that's much more complex. When we think about nuclear deterrence, it was only two players. It was much easier. Now we have three major players. What does that mean? Let me give you one simple example. For example, if we want to deter both Russia and China, and Russia and China each have, let's say, 3,000 nuclear weapons, and I'm really oversimplifying this. So we think we need to have 6,000 if you want to deter both of them. So now China sits there. They're thinking about this whole situation. So, well, we are friends with Russians right now. That has not always been the case. That could change. At some point, I may have to deter both Americans and Russians. So I gotta have 9,000. Because Americans have 6 now, Russians have 3. And you can see where this goes. This is a security dilemma that everybody has to have more and more in order to feel secure. So that's geostrategic environment by itself very complex to begin with. And we don't know how to deal with it, by the way. This is a challenge. That's why I'm glad we have some young students back there thinking about these things. Emil, some of us are going to retire. We want to retire in peace. This is your job to think about, by the way, and solve. And we're leaving you a complex problem you have to figure out. So that's just one element of the drivers for what we call uncertainty as we go to the third nuclear age. The second driver is technology. We were sitting here, we were just talking about artificial intelligence, quantum technology, disinformation, misinformation. You name all of these things, cyber attacks, gray zone attacks. So combine that with this geostrategic environment. Now you're cutting you're taking a complex situation, making it even more complex. You add to it now climate change. Climate change is accelerating, and as this is accelerating, you have countries that are going to have flooding. They're going to have droughts. So I think part of the immigration wave we see coming from the south is driven by climate change. These farmers, they're either getting flooded or they're actually getting droughts, so they cannot grow their crops. And they don't have the system to put in place. So all of these combine into a highly complex system. So which means there's a lot of opportunities for risks. I don't want to be too negative. There's also a lot of opportunities to do good things out of this. Because I think some point, these things become existential problems that we have to work together to solve. We're going to need the Russians and Chinese and everybody else to help us to solve these problems. So kind of give you a little bit of a sense how we think about this thing here. I can probably go on all day on this one slide, but I promised my wife, Mary, not to put anybody to sleep. For example, one of the things we worry about is you want to make sure we put strategies and technology in place to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. And one framework we use, to kind of give you just one example, is what are the stages in proliferation? So the first step is that there are some countries motivated to develop nuclear weapons. Can you guys think of a country today that's motivated to have nuclear weapons but doesn't have it?
Iran.
Iran.
Iran was one. Saudi Arabia would put it in that category. So they've been talking about it. South Korea, they made some noise.
Mm-hmm.
So those are kind of things that come up. So those are the idea of a country having a motive. What can we do in order to persuade these countries not to be motivated? So one is, for example, can be security assurances. We have this thing called extended deterrence, that we can put you under our nuclear umbrella. You don't need to develop your own nuclear weapons. So South Korea is an example right there. The second stage is we try to persuade this country not to build nuclear weapons. They go to development stage. And I think some of you said Iran. Iran is a perfect example of a country in a development stage, that they're getting the capabilities to build nuclear weapons, but they haven't actually built one yet. So they haven't quite achieved it. So here we can put sanctions on the country, we can put export control, diplomacy, negotiations, JCPOA, and other things that we've done in Iran is a good example. So let's say we're not successful, then this hypothetical country actually develops nuclear weapons. So that's the achievement stage. So a good example of this one, can you tell somebody, give me an example of this, a country who has actually achieved nuclear weapons?
India, Pakistan, Israel,
North Korea.
North Korea.
North Korea, they came out. India and Pakistan, those are good examples. So they actually went through developments. They had the motivation. They went through their development stage. They went ahead and actually worked on it. They actually have declared they have nuclear weapons. They've been tested.
One of the deterrences is inspections, and in the Middle East, until Israel agrees to inspection, you got a problem.
So I'll come back to that. That's a good question. If you allow me, if you could hold your questions, I'll come back to it. And we're going to go into a good discussion. Let me, before I go too far, there's a multilateral treaty called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This was negotiated in 1960s. It went into effect. It's a very successful treaty. There were 192 countries, I believe, that have signed the treaties. And there are two classes of members. One is 5 countries that are nuclear weapon states. So under the treaty, there's 3 pillars. Under the treaty, these 5 countries, that's United States, us, Soviet Union, Russia now, you have United Kingdom, France, and China. They have joined the treaty as a nuclear weapon state. But we have promised under the disarmament pillar that we will get rid of all of our nuclear weapons at some future date. So that's what we call the disarmament pillar. And we actually did pretty well for a while. From the height of the Cold War, when we had each 20, 30,000 nuclear weapons, we went down to 3,000 to 4,000. And we were going down even under Obama's presidency. At one point, there was even talks about 0 nuclear weapons. We're actually doing some research what that means. What does it mean to have 0 nuclear weapons? But in this third nuclear age, with Russia now building, rejuvenating their nuclear weapons arsenal, with China, I think, very aggressive. They're modernizing, they're building nuclear weapons at a very fast rate. That actually, they're going to be our peer fairly soon. We just can't afford unilaterally by ourselves to reduce our weapons. That's the simple, hard fact that we just cannot do it. And we have tried talking to Russians and Chinese. They just don't want to talk arms control. And so under that treaty, the other countries, every other country who has joined, they have joined as a non-nuclear weapon states. And the gentleman's agreement is they signed a treaty that they promise not to develop nuclear weapons. In return, they get the benefits of nuclear technology. Nuclear power plants to generate electricity, nuclear medicine, agriculture. So we, as a nuclear weapon state, we have an obligation to help these countries who are in good standing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that's the nuclear uses for peaceful uses. That's the third pillar. So there are 3 pillars of the NPT when we get to the discussion: disarmament, non-proliferation, and as you promised not to develop nuclear weapons. And that's where we have inspections to go into these countries to make sure they're not using their nuclear materials or technology to build nuclear weapons. And the last one is peaceful uses of nuclear technology. There are 4 countries that are not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So India and Pakistan, they never joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They developed nuclear weapons, so they were not actually in violation. Then we have North Korea. North Korea joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Here's an interesting case. They got the benefits of nuclear reactors. They got the benefits of actually this treaty, but they withdrew from the treaty and they built nuclear weapons. So some argued that was illegal, therefore the whole program is illegal. Israel never joined the NPT, and that's a non-fact. So then you go into the last stage, which is retirement. So there's a country, they had the motivation, they have developed it, they achieved nuclear weapons, they actually then retired the nuclear weapons. Can anybody give me an example of a country that went to all the
South Africa.
South Africa, perfect. So that's one country that actually went to all the 4 stages. At the end of it, I think they had 6 or 7 nuclear weapons that they gave up and retired. So this is kind of how we take this complex problem, try to break it down, in that for each stage we try to come up with strategies that our part is really we are a science and technology laboratory. We look at science and technology to verify and monitor these different neighborhoods. So a little bit of advertisement about CMC capabilities. So we have a number of regional expertise. So we have regional expertise in Middle East and Africa, South Asia, East Asia. We just added Western Hemisphere. There was one region that we're actually neglecting. We've also added the polar regions, Arctic and Antarctica. Those are becoming flashpoints. As the ice is melting in the Arctic, the waterways are opening, Russians are coming. Chinese are calling themselves this term near Arctic nation, which doesn't mean anything, by the way. They're trying to wedge themselves into the Arctic. And the Antarctica Treaty expires in 2040. So that's another thing we think about, what happens next? What are we going to be doing? Because they could become a free-for-all, that people start claiming parts of Antarctica. So we actually have people who know these regions, they speak the language. So if I need somebody who can tell me about Russia and Putin, I've got at least a couple of people to go to. If you don't have it, you know where to go to get more expertise. Middle East, always go to them, say, explain this to me. How does this work? We do a lot of strategic studies, kind of like the example I gave you, how we take these problems and we break it down, how we do systems analysis. We have a technology training and demonstration area. This is where we bring our colleagues from 120 different countries to show them how we use technology to monitor and verify agreements and treaties. One of our key attributes for success is what we call our visiting research scholars. This is where we bring our scholars from different countries. They typically stay with us for about 3 months. That picture you see on the bottom right, there's an Israeli scholar, Palestinian, Egyptian, and a Jordanian. The Jordanian and the Egyptian is not in the picture. And they came to stay with us for 3 months. And the problem they wanted to solve was infectious diseases. Because if there's an infectious disease, it spread in that small region really fast. It's really not that big. The first time I flew over Israel to go land in Jordan, Amman, I mean, the whole thing, I could see from Mediterranean to Amman from my plane. I was kind of shocked how small this place is. So if there is an infectious disease, it doesn't know any borders. It's going to go all across. So they came up with a system called MESIDS, if I remember what it was, Middle East Infectious Diseases Consortium. And basically what they were doing, they were sharing infectious disease information from their hospitals and clinics. So we gave them computers, so we set up the technology to enable sharing of this data that had agreed to share. I'm proud to say, even today, this system is still working. And it was actually, we're using it during COVID to exchange information. Even with everything that's going on, some of the hospitals were still exchanging information today. Then we have a series on education. So we have speakers that come in, kind of like what you have here tonight. And they kind of educate us to what the latest developments in our policy making is. We need to be aware what our policymakers' problems are, how to solve it. We have seminars, workshops. We have what we call Track 2 engagements. How many of you have heard of Track 2's engagements? So these are unofficial diplomatic meetings that we can meet with our counterparts in a safe environment, not attribution, so we can freely talk about problems. I think that's when we have one for Middle East, we have one for East Asia, one for South Asia. One of the interesting ones was in South Asia. We had 2 scholars, 2 retired generals, one from India and one from Pakistan. They came, and what they wanted to do, they were both nuclear powered. They were worried about an unintended nuclear incident between India and Pakistan. So they wanted to do things to reduce tensions between the 2 countries. So they came up with this idea along the border to put some sensors in order to detect people going back and forth as part of transparency. So they came out of that Track 2 meeting. They came to visit us. We actually helped them design a system. We have a test one at San Diego. that has a tower. We put systems in place for detection. And they came up with 3 crossing points across India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, the politics got in the way. Even though the technology is ready, the politicians weren't ready to cooperate. So that's, whatever they're ready, we got the technology going. So those kind of examples of the kind of things we do at the Cooperative Monitoring Center. And again, kind of an example of how we go about it. So we have track 2s to explore the problem space. We do some technology testing, evaluation for them. And so we do a lot of building, hands-on work on this. I know I'm going over my time, so coming here, we engage 120 different countries. And to give you one example is, for example, in the Middle East. So we established a sister facility in the Middle East in Amman, Jordan, at the bottom right. It's called Middle East Scientific Institute for Security. One of the things we worked with the Jordanians was to help them secure the border with Syria. So the problem we were having with Syrians was there's a lot of drugs and everything was coming down from Syria to Jordan, from Jordan go to Saudi Arabia, by the way. So then the top right is an interesting one. There's a lot of anthrax that happens naturally in nature. It happens to livestock. And so we had a project in Afghanistan. And in order to check the cattle and everybody else if they have anthrax, they had to go take a blood test out of it, go over the mountains, take it to the city to have it tested. It'll be weeks putting you if they had anthrax or not. So these, we developed these cards, size of a credit card, that we give it to these shepherds. They take a blood sample, they put it in, and within minutes tells them if they have anthrax or not. So that's an example of the project we've done with technology. With that, I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your time.